adopting the CIS Controls framework, the biggest benefits and challenges, and firing your clients. When should MSSPs cut ties with their customers? That and the latest news and trends in the managed security space coming right up on Cyber for Hire.
Building bridges between managed security providers and their clients, it's the podcast where MSPs, vCISOs, and end users take a united stand against cybercrime. This is Cyber for Hire.
All right, welcome friends to episode number 14 of Cyber for Hire. How's everybody doing today? I'm Bradley Barth with SC Media in New York, and joining me today, 6 time zones away in sunny Hawaii, is my co-host and partner in cybercrime, Ryan Morris, principal consultant with Morris Management Partners. Ryan, I know you're dying to know, as of March 23rd, when we're recording this, all of my final 4 picks are still alive. In fact, I think I'm number 1 in possible future points for the rest of the tournament in my office pool, so that grand prize of an extra day off is still within my reach.
See, now that is truly impressive. Whatever else we do today, that one is very, very impressive for me, and I think for everyone else. I'm officially at the stage of 0 of my final 4 picks are available, and in fact, the University of Arizona, who I picked to win it all, went out on the very first day. So, this was mine was living in upside down land. If you just look at my picks, go the opposite way.
Yes, the bracket officially busted big time on that one. Well, at least one of us is still in the running. So we'll see what happens over the course of the next week or so. But anyway, plenty to cover today as always. But some news is just so important it can't wait, which is why we want to share with everyone what's top of mind today. So here's your headline. The NSA and CISA recently released best practices for InfoSec professionals whose job it is to manage digital identities. As detailed by SC Media's Mengin Shao, these IAM recommendations, which are a new addition to the public-private partnership known as the Enduring Security Framework, they provide guidance and mitigations to address threats in 5 areas: identity governance, environmental hardening, identity federation / single sign-on, MFA, and auditing and monitoring around IAM tools. Ryan, why is this top of mind for you today?
See, I think a common theme that has been emerging in the last, I would say, maybe 4 to 6 months across the cybersecurity landscape is let's focus on fundamentals and control what we can control, and then we'll try to get creative and figure out how we deal with all of the uncontrollable factors, the attacks, the threat vectors, etc. Identity ought to be the foundation of everything that we do. We cannot know who to let in a zero trust framework unless we know who you are. We cannot give you privileged access. We cannot allow you through network access control protocols. Absolutely nothing in cybersecurity happens without an identification of who the human is that's actually accessing this stuff. We are, again, fans of frameworks, and we are believers that foundational technologies and some of the best practices for implementing this stuff in the real world, hey, the more guidance we can give to everybody for standards and practices, that's a good thing. This is an especially relevant thing. What's interesting / disconcerting, maybe a little bit in the world, is how many people have moved on to what I will call higher order security questions. They are dealing with automation and AI. They are focused on some of the very edge case scenarios without having solidly implemented identity protocols. So I'm all for let's go out and solve the big problems as well. But first things first, right? Let's start with the basics of who are you and how do I know that is actually you and not being spoofed into my system? And from there, all of the other protocols get a little bit more effective. So very big fans of this framework. And that, again, rocket science is not our protocol. Right? Like, let's be clear. We're not trying to overcomplicate anything, but when I look at the 5 basic areas for identity management that they are highlighting, I think that that is reasonable. I believe that those are technologies well established, and it's a question of not figuring it out, but of effective implementation. So I think that's a really good development, and something we all ought to look for consistency on. So, Bradley, your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, just, always important to get those foundational building blocks in place. Like you said before, then you want to further build out your edge cases. So I think that's great advice there. We want to hear if you agree or disagree or, just any other thoughts on this or other timely news matters going on in the managed security space. So feel free to write to us at cyber4hire at cyberriskalliance.com. We always want to hear your opinions. Anyway, that's our top of mind hot take for the day. More later in the show in terms of news. But first, it's time for our featured InfoSec news and trends topic of the week, presenting our big idea in security, adopting the CIS Controls framework, the biggest benefits and challenges. Now, in its 8th iteration, the Center for Internet Security's Critical Security Controls, or CIS Controls framework, provides organizations with 18 categories of high priority best practices that they can follow in order to improve their cyber hygiene while remaining in step with key regulations. In this segment, we'll look at what MSSPs and their client bases need to know if they opt to follow CIS's guidelines versus other competing frameworks. What are the biggest barriers to successful implementation? What are the biggest benefits? Which best practices are managed services providers best equipped to conduct? And where might they need some assistance? We want to cover all of these questions and more in this segment, which is sponsored by LionGuard. Visit msspalert.com/LionGuard to learn more about them. And that brings us to our pair of special guests today. We have Joe Alapat and Matt Miller. Joe Alapat is co-founder and CEO of LionGuard. Joe is a successful entrepreneur with more than 2 decades of experience managing IT infrastructure for businesses of all sizes under the care of an IT managed service provider that he owned, operated, and sold. Following his exit, he founded LionGuard to address the growing IT service provider challenge of managing and securing modern IT at scale with strong visibility, automation, and insight. And then meanwhile, we have Matt Miller, as I said, who oversees LionGuard's team of product managers, requirements engineers, and design professionals to set and design the company's product roadmap. Before joining LionGuard in 2018, Matt spent over a decade in the MSP space in Austin, Texas, starting as an engineer before moving to management roles, overseeing the project engineering group and account management. And so, Matt and Joe, really glad that the both of you could be here today. I feel like the sensible place to start here, before we even get more into the benefits and the challenges of the CIS framework, is what really distinguishes it in your mind the most from some of the other common popular security controls frameworks that organizations can choose from?
Yeah, I can get started there. Thank you, Bradley. Thank you, Ryan, for having us here on the show. Started about talking about frameworks and the topic of blocking and tackling. Really, just getting the fundamentals right, and really feel strongly with regards to CIS being about those fundamentals and really building a strong foundation. I think that's a big part of the key thing with CIS and really the thing that we've seen with regards to CIS and the critical security controls has been this continued focus on keeping it up to date and iterating through it, knowing that something from 7-8 years ago, the landscape changes, technology is changing at such a fast pace, and so it being at version 8.x and continuing to advance is very, very critical. So love the fact that CIS keeps things up to date. And then really the thing that I find with CIS more so than most any other framework is the ability for it to actually be common English language. The vocabulary is very down to earth, very understandable for anyone servicing an end customer. I've found that, and I hear this from so many other service providers, that the language is very translatable to the end customer. And I think that's so key. Is security is a complex topic. It can be mysterious. It can be intimidating, and so having a common vocabulary based on what I would consider to be a basic understanding of things that the end customer understands, it helps bring them into the fold and helps build confidence around them making investments around these areas. So I think that's great. And the last point that I would add is that I think the way that things have been set up with CIS has been more of a roadmap with the implementation group process, where there's a thought process of moving maturity levels as you go along, and that's that combination of down to earth thought process with this implementation group process, and always staying up to date. I think it just packs like a triple punch.
And Matt, from your perspective, I'm curious to understand, as you guys manage the product, right? Like roadmaps and iterations, that's the way we live in the product development world, and to have a framework in the industry that mirrors that kind of incremental progress, I think that's interesting. Is it realistic to approach all 18 items on the checklist? Is that, checklists make everything easier and a little bit more manageable, but is that a lot? Is that something that we take in iterations? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think that there definitely is an incrementality to it, right? Especially if you're kind of from a standing start as far as a security program, right? Every MSP worth their salt is doing something in the form of security, but that's different than having sort of a formalized security program that is really implemented well. It's provably implemented, and that's what kind of CIS is really about. So yeah, I mean, there are dimensionalities within the CIS framework too, right? There are the controls themselves, but then there are also the implementation groups that sort of give you within each control, okay, kind of what order do we want to approach these in? If we're kind of at that standing start state, how do we get up to speed? So yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot of risk in going, yeah, we're going to implement, all 18 controls across all three implementation groups. We're going to just get this done overnight. That's not how the real world works, especially when you're running a real business with real fires and real customer onboardings and kind of the reality that every MSP lives. So yeah, I mean, I think approaching it realistically, but then the CIS framework, I think, also does a good job though of laying those things out, kind of giving you a framework, not just for the security, kind of what boxes need to be checked, which switches need to be flipped which direction, but also what's the level of priority? In what order should you tackle those things? I think is another virtue of this particular framework.
Yeah, since we talked a little bit just before about having foundational building blocks and then building off of that, would you say that amongst those 18 categories, there's a couple that really seem to be a great start for your foundation in most cases? It might be a little different for everyone, but do you find that there are certain ones that more than others that tend to be a smart starting point?
Yeah, and again, CIS does kind of make it a layup in a sense. I mean, the controls number one and number two are all about inventory of assets and of software. Do you even know what you have, right? Like we say that a lot at Lion Guard. We say that about how to utilize our product, but also just about how to run a good MSP. You can't possibly secure and manage what you don't even know about. And with the explosion of complexity of the IT stack in the last, let's say 15 years, but it's probably been going on a little longer than that at this point with the move to cloud technologies and just sort of the diversity of things. It's no longer just, workstations and servers and kind of the stuff we always used to manage with RMM. I mean, that's do you even know what you've got? Do you even understand your surface area fully? Is the first challenge. And again, CIS Control 1 and 2. It's right at the beginning.
Yeah, I love that that kind of begin with what you know. We kind of touched on that at the top of today's program, but Joe, I'm thinking of this from an MSP's perspective, right? As I look at the inventory complexity of all of we've talked recently on our program here about needing to get beyond the core Wintel stack, right? To borrow that used to be a nice little neighborhood. We knew what was there. We could control it. And now there's 50,000 sensor-based devices, and we do that. How do you balance that from an MSP's point of view of complexity versus opportunity? Because in my mind, More devices, hey, that looks like more opportunity to add value and to earn income. So how do you balance the complexity with the opportunity?
That's a really good point. I think it starts with first having just visibility to those assets and being able to show that complexity to the end customer. I don't think they'll have an appreciation for what it is that the service provider is dealing with unless they can actually see all of these things. And I think that's one of the biggest struggles every service provider has, is to share, here's what we see, and I'm providing you value around these services, and the complexity of this is X, and it's going to take effort to manage this. So I think balancing it comes with first sharing information with the end customer, and really showing them the depth of all of this. And then past that, I always think in terms of what is the service provider's area of expertise. What is their background in those areas? And when you think about frameworks like CIS, which are very, very fundamental in terms of where do they get started, I hope that most service providers are familiar with being able to identify the hardware and the assets, the software. We talked about, you all mentioned identity, CIS control number 5 around account management, and being able to know the accounts that are there. The concepts are fundamental, and I think what I would suggest any service provider doing is don't skip ahead to those more complex things and handle those things without first starting with the most basic things, because you will miss the boat, and you'll stumble further ahead trying to address some type of complex AI technology to go solve for one type of attack vector when you've left the door open in something much, much more basic. Just because you haven't been doing the blocking and tackling around administrative accounts that are existing across all of the various assets. So I would say start from the least complex, work your way up, but always share that information and complexity with the end customer.
Yeah, and to add to that a little bit, I would say also, I think from the balance of opportunity and kind of risk, I suppose, it's also just about how kind of scalably and repeatably can you service those new IoT devices or whatever, right? Like I remember, back in my MSP days, our impetus was always to go, oh, there's a new thing. Oh yeah, we can manage that. To really lean into the technology and kind of like want to help our customer, which is great. But if it's just scaling with complete manual effort, and wow, we don't really know the best practices, we're going to have to go off and learn this, and all of a sudden we're in the red on this new thing we're offering to our customers. It's about, can you turn that into a scalable and repeatable thing, and the repeatability ties right back to CIS, right? How does it plug into your framework to secure it, this new stuff, the exact same way you secure everything else, ideally?
Yeah, and you mentioned, of course, since we're talking about complexity really being one of the challenges to contend with, it seems like we've kind of gotten into that portion of discussion now to talk a little bit about some of the challenges for MSSPs and other organizations looking to follow this framework. You did a very nice job of kind of laying out some of the benefits in your introduction when you talked about things like the framework being very frequently updated and the common vocabulary and everything. But yeah, let's focus a little bit more on the challenges as well. So if complexity is one, what would you identify as maybe some of the other key challenges that adopters will at least want to be aware of so that they're prepared to adequately tackle it?
Yeah, I would say that a big one is just like kind of plainly stated that it's not very sexy, right? It's not going off to buy some shiny new widget. It's not, we're going to be able to roll out some big technical project. It's administrative in some ways. It's how are we going to have sort of a governance process around, okay, not just did we set the thing up correctly, but can we prove that we set it up correctly? And can we then, on again a repeatable basis, prove that it stayed set up correctly? That's not the, again, sort of the challenge that every MSP engineer that's necessarily going to light their fire on a day-to-day basis. But again, kind of going back to the overarching point that we've been talking about since the beginning of the show today, it's about the basic block and tackling. Like you have to do it. It just has to be done, or you're never going to get there from a security program perspective.
And Joe, you talked about, again, I think advantages and disadvantages, they're very closely tied together. Common language creates communication efficiency, right? Like, I know what you're talking about, you know what I'm talking about. We can get right to the heart of the issue. One of the challenges we perceive is the need to get across the aisle with the customer. It's one thing to be able to identify all of this complexity and communicate it to the CISO at the customer location. CFO, maybe a little bit different conversation. The people who approve budgets, the people who actually authorize changes in business process to match some of our recommended protocols. How do you see this kind of framework managing the challenges into other parts of the business, or does it create more vocabulary that we need to teach other folks, or does it simplify that process?
I think the key thing drives towards a reputational factor of using a framework when communicating to other parts of the organization. If in the early days of service provider, just managing IT and security, it was freeform, right? And it was best practices that were developed by an individual or a firm, and you're trying to relay that to different parts of the organization. Now, compare that to bringing forward a framework and actually being able to point it at something that's reputable, that's out there, that is continuously been messaged about. It adds as a validation factor. So I think in a lot of ways, when speaking to a CFO, when speaking to other parts of the organization, it creates the foundation on which someone says, okay, this isn't some crazy idea. There's consensus around this in the community, and there's a consistent process to think about how to handle security so that I don't feel like this is artwork. And so from that standpoint, the creativity is pulled out, and it is, in some ways, it can be perceived as administrative. And I kind of think of it as a field goal kicker job. You really have to keep kicking it through the uprights, and if you don't get those fundamentals right, then everyone's like, "What happened?" Right? You expect that you're kicking it through the uprights every time, but let's go do that, and let's go do that with regular rhythm. The validity of having that framework, and them doing a Google search later to say, they were talking about this critical security control number or whatever. Is this even a thing? Yes, they're going to find something valid out there, and it will help to move the needle around approval, around why something needs to get done, and why the service provider needs to deliver on some of these outcomes.
I want to go back to the 18 categories that we alluded to before. I think it would be interesting to just dive into that a little bit deeper and ask the question, if I were to ask you to assess the MSSP community as a whole, which of the 18 categories would you highlight as MSSPs as a whole being the strongest at? And then conversely, where would you say they're most struggling? And in the areas that they are most struggling, what can they do to gain help in those particular key areas?
I can speak to that, Bradley, to get started. And I think that goes back to much of what a service provider is able to move on much quicker is driven by the vendor ecosystem, having a solution that helps to go address, let's say, one of those controls. And when I think about the world of the MSSP, I think about things like continuous vulnerability assessment. I think about malware defenses. These types of data recovery, where you've got pre-existing solutions that exist that go solve for some or a large part of that control. I think those areas, the MSSP and or MSP is going to do very well in terms of being able to have proof around solving for those controls. When it drives towards process, when it drives to continuous iteration around a process that needs to be implemented on a weekly, monthly, daily basis, that's where I've generally seen, and we've observed, where things start to get a little bit more where you start to struggle around. Hey, do you walk me through whether you are actually inventorying all of the assets in the environment? Are you actually inventorying all of the accounts across all of the infrastructure you're managing? And those things sound simple. It's not. It's actually not that simple. It looks basic as a statement, but in some cases, the tooling and technology that's out there doesn't give us the ability to reach across such a large landscape and really think that we have all of it under control. Matt, I don't know if you have anything more to add.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that a little bit. Yeah, I think that the things you touched on, Joe, around kind of patch management, account management, that there are certainly still struggles there, but they're sort of, I think, at the more well understood end of the spectrum. CIS, the controls also get into things like data protection, right? Like, so CIS Control 13, and that's where you can start to get into pretty deep water as far as business processes. Where is all the sensitive data in the organization? That's like a next level inventory challenge. And then, okay, have we applied the correct technical controls? Even once we figure out where all that data lives, have we then applied the correct technical controls as far as encryption and exfiltration and kind of all those things? So again, it's a wide set of things. And yeah, just kind of the asset inventory and then getting into, patch management, things like that, that's kind of a huge part of it, but also at relatively surface level in some cases.
Well, and as you guys are looking at it, right? Because the point is, a framework is only as effective as people implement it in the real world. If I am an MSP who thinks this is a good idea, would add to my credibility, would help me get deeper into the customer's organization, that all sounds cool. Where do I start? Like, are there educational resources? How do we get this from that's a really good idea into practical application? If I'm starting from scratch, or if I'm somebody who's touched on a few but isn't fully adopting all of the 18 controls, what's your recommendation for getting started?
Yeah, so I mean, CIS themselves have a wealth of information on their site, really high quality breakdowns of the rule, of the controls, why they matter, how they're applicable. So there are some great, both written and kind of video resources there. I think that there is also a growing trend in the industry, including with LionGuard, to sort of tie our own tools more directly to those types of frameworks. So like in our platform, we have actionable alert rules, and we have a mapping of those to the CIS controls. So I think there's a growing, not to make this too much about Lion, but I think there is a growing support from vendors in general to mapping to these frameworks, and sort of as a part of the broader, I think, industry realization that the sort of best effort, hey, this is how we do security approach just won't work anymore, that we have to have kind of standardized frameworks. I think that the vendor support across the board is also following that trend, as it should.
I think the one thing I would add to that is that don't get too intimidated by every single one of the sub controls that are listed. I think it's really important to think about the implementation groups, and let's get to first base. Let's get to that. Let's start making some headway. Don't get intimidated by the completeness of some of those controls, because there's a lot going on, but you're able to build your way up to that process. So that's the other thought process is, as you're reviewing content or trying to understand what the critical controls are, like look at implementation group 1 and focus there.
Yeah. See, and again, starting with fundamentals, that we didn't plan for that to be a theme, but it has come to be a theme for this conversation, because it's very easy for us to get very scared, right? You look at the wide world and you go, 10,000 threats and 10,000 vulnerabilities. How do I solve them all tomorrow? And the answer is you don't. So you might as well start with number 1 and number 2 and number 3, right? We get incrementally better, which leads us, we're going to transition with you guys, because obviously this is a deep topic where we could keep going for a long time. But before we let you go, we want to get to know you guys a little bit better, because our industry is famous for a lot of chicken littles and a lot of sky is falling kind of terminology. So we want to invite you guys to participate with us in a segment that we call What Scares You? So Matt and Joe, before we got together here, we were brainstorming about some of the big challenges in the marketplace, and how do we help people feel a little bit calm. And we're always trying to say, hey, be the voice of reason, whatever. But through all of that stuff, even as security practitioners, there are things that legitimately freak us out. Which ones get to you guys?
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
I
You can
can get,
start.
yeah. For me, it's these sort of the intersection of technology and human psychology that we see on display. I think, in particular, in things like propaganda that's dramatically accelerated by social media and other kind of tech forms of technology. I think that there's a pretty ample body of evidence out there at this point that there are state actors and others who sort of have professionalized the ways to put a message out there, amplify it artificially, and kind of hook into human psychology in a pretty bad way. So that scares me. I think that the sort of the evolution of Chat GPT, for example, kind of the AI angle, is it going to just make it that much easier for that kind of content to be generated at scale and put out there? So that's a lot, but I guess it scares me, but it's also sort of the call to action to just breathe through it sometimes, right? Not everything you see out there is real, and just kind of have your fact check hat on at all times.
Joe,
For
your
sure.
thoughts?
Totally.
What scares you out there?
Well, I would drill down deeper into the topic. Matt went down into Chat GPT and just AI powered actors who are leveraging the assistance of AI for whatever it might be. I've been continuing to see the progress around the improvement around phishing, spear phishing techniques using technologies like ChatGPT to help anyone who's going off to run through these exercises, remove a lot of the manual processes for them to go off and get started. Right. So the same thing happens for us from solving for the positive side in terms of defense. From the offense side, the running start happens. And I think of this as an analogy to solutions like Metasploit, where you can choose to use it for good to be able to identify and penetrate environments, but bad actors can use it as well. And it gives them a running start to be able to automate to get into that running start. And then with tools like ChatGPT, writing a spear phishing email becomes easier, potentially creating malware. We're seeing some of this happening where there's techniques that are they're being used to help to get that assistance to get to the running start, which allows folks that might not have been able to make progress on these things to be able to start to play around with this technology in a way that they could start to make leaps forward. So that's worrisome. It's still so early right now. And that means that from a defense side, we need to think about what does that mean for how we need to leverage the same technology to protect the environments.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Joe. And actually, in terms of using things like Chat GPT for better, more convincing phishing emails, one of the standard telltale hallmarks of a phishing email used to be, look at all these typos, look at all these terrible spelling mistakes, this awful grammar. This was obviously, written by someone, maybe, English wasn't necessarily their first language, whatever it is. There were signs that, like, this is not a very, professionally written email. This probably really didn't come from my business partner. Now with these computer programs, they're written perfectly. They're almost too perfect. It's like you almost have to go the opposite direction now. If you read an email and the grammar is too impeccable, it probably means that it's a phishing email written by an AI program, because nobody has that good. Trust me, as somebody who's been a reporter and editor for a long time, most people have at least a little bit of bad grammar. That's what scares me and keeps me up at night, is bad grammar. So it's like it's almost the opposite now. It's like these things write so impeccably that there are no more mistakes anymore. It's really interesting.
We need a Chat GPT filter on the email side to say, yes, this was produced, right? Just the same way the professors are using it to detect essays being written by Chat GPT.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think you guys, you hit on the hard part, right? We can write rules and controls and implement security protocols that will deal with the technical challenges. But when it comes down to human psychology, hey, humans have been persuaded of some pretty crazy things since the dawn of time. technology just multiplies that stuff and makes it way faster. And Joe, you use the terminology running start. I think that's the issue out there, right? It's not that these attacks are necessarily different. It is that there's so many more of them that are so much better right away that all of a sudden the filter factor goes to, I just need to turn everything off. And then I can start letting things back in one at a time. That, unfortunately, that sounds effective from a security point of view. It also sounds like the opposite of doing business. So might be a challenge.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks, Joe and Matt, for sufficiently scaring us with your what scares you answer. We appreciate it. I'm sure Ryan and I will be tossing and turning all night now, knowing that Chat GPT users might be out to get us. But in the meantime, that's going to wrap up the first half of our show. So please return for the second half of our episode featuring our MSSP business and industry topic of the week, firing your clients. When should MSSPs cut ties with their customers? That plus our InfoSec news rundown and our Dear Cyber for Hire advice column segment. All that coming up. So we will see you in a moment on the other side.